It's a very different time in history in the 1950s, which is not so long ago. People went about their life as usual until one little girl called Maria Hertog came along. Born of Dutch parents but raised by a Muslim foster mother, Maria became the focus of one of the most publicized racial tensions in Singapore's history. Such was the 1950s, a period of strikes and riots, forming the backdrop for politics that was to unfold in the next few years. In 1959, the young leaders of the People's Action Party had fought and won power in Singapore's first fully elected Legislative Assembly. For the first time in their lives, Singaporeans were in control of their destiny. But the Singapore they inherited cut a very different postcard picture. This was Singapore. Many areas were undeveloped. People lived in shacks. Sanitation was poor. Singapore's population had also grown since the end of World War II. Thousands had no jobs. By the 1960s, Singapore was hit by massive unemployment, a situation ripe for the communists to exploit. The greatest challenge was to find jobs for what was referred to as the army of unemployed.
The challenges were so dire, it was easy to get people to come forward, good men to come forward and take on the job, because if we fail, then everything is lost. I was fortunate in that I had a very good, very strong colleague in Dr. Goh Keng Swee. So I appointed him finance minister because that was the most important portfolio. If we don't get the finance right, then nothing else can be done.
What to do about it? Well, I'm damned if I knew anything about, running a country different from reading economic textbooks. Fortunately, I knew the ambassador of Israel was then posted in Bangkok, and I told him, look, let me spend some time in your country. Have a look at how you set up industries, because at that time Israel was really good. So I spent about 3 weeks in Israel and learned about how they promoted industry, because the thing to do is to promote industry.
In 1960, a UN Industrial Survey mission visited Singapore. It was led by Dr. Albert Winsemius. He had helped to revitalize his battered Dutch homeland after World War II. He knew that Singapore could not survive just as a trading center. It needed to industrialize, to create jobs, and to develop further as a country. These issues had to be made into concerns for everyone in the country.
I come to Nee Soon to look after the small things: drains, roads, electric lights, water pipes, and so on. But the small things depends on the big things: merger, stability, security, economic development. If we've got that, then we've got prosperity. Then the taxes will pay for the roads, the lights, the community centers, the clinics, the people's welfare.
Jurong, a name that will make Singapore famous in a new way.
The task began to make wasteland profitable. Nobody then thought Jurong would work. Critics were waiting to call this venture Go's folly if it should fail.
Well, the reaction must be very varied. I mean, at that time, people had little knowledge of industry. And they were naturally quite skeptical. But we don't care. We just press on.
Dr. Goh's next move. Despite difficulties in getting investors to Jurong, he set up a toll gate charging $50 for each lorry or bus entering the area. This was in part to encourage companies to house workers in Jurong. Employers were angry, but Dr. Goh had his reasons.
When you make an industrial estate, you got to have roads, power, railway transportation, and a port. So these things will be very costly if you have to finance them. And you finance them, you got to charge the users. I never have doubts at any point of time. I mean, you were just going, when you're on the job, there's so many things to resolve so that you don't worry about, whether the thing will succeed or not.
On the opening day, the Finance Minister, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, told workers and friends, Singapore is a state in a hurry, and steel is one of the most important industries for our growth. It's one of the basic industries for sparking off a whole train of allied industries, which will turn Singapore into the New York of Malaysia.
Building the infrastructure was only part of the problem. Jurong would fail if no investors wanted to set up factories. So in 1961, after the Winsemius report, Parliament passed an act to form the EDB, or the Economic Development Board. Its mission was to attract foreign investments, promote Singapore, and become a one-stop agency for investors. Both Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and Dr. Goh Keng Swee agreed that only the best man must head the EDB, and they both decided on the late Mr. Hon Swee Sen. Mr. Hon Swee Sen, the father of EDB, in his own words, said that the task was then to develop virtually from scratch an organization that would be the chief instrument and prime mover not only of Singapore's industrialization, but that industry was to be a leading sector of Singapore's economy, of Singapore's rapid growth.
He was a friend of mine, and I think a contemporary of Dr. Goh Keng Swee in Raffles College before the war. So they knew each other well, or we all knew each other well, so there was no problem about communication and understanding the long-term objectives and getting our ideas across to each other.
Mr. Lee, he is what I call the conceptualizer. No? He's the man with the ideas. Dr. Goh is the architect, the planner, architect, draws out the outline. And Mr. Horn is the builder, I tell you that. So I think, I won't say who is more important than who, but I think that the three of them really achieve, complement each other.
It was one of those fortuitous times in history where there were right people at the right time, at the right place.
That was a key combination of people and their qualities that got the EDB and got our finance situation right. Had I not have such people, I don't think we could have succeeded so well.
Then in 1963, Singapore became part of Malaysia. Then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew galvanized the people to become one nation under the Federation of Malaysian flag.
Against those who are out to wreck our new nation. A period of great trial lies ahead. But the future also holds great promise. Promise of peace, stability, and prosperity. If we have the resolve, the stamina, and the wisdom to meet the challenge that lies ahead.
But this posed a different set of problems to the economic planners.
And in the 2 years that we were in Malaysia, we were not able to get approval for a single pioneer certificate. It was a very frustrating experience, having to send letters to Kuala Lumpur, lengthy explanations, and then long letters would come back in Malay, which you had to translate and understand what it was all about, and then reply. And this ding-dong went on for 2 years.
Then there was the problem of a difficult bureaucracy at home.
EDB had a lot of difficulties persuading other government departments to be flexible, to look at at things in a new way. They were bound by old approaches which were not relevant and not helpful anymore. Various regulatory authorities, from the Inspector of Factories to the Ministry of Health, and all of them were used to operating under a regime where, people come to you and you just tell them yes or no. They did not have a promotional kind of attitude, how to get Singapore going. Their job was, somebody else has got to get it going. Our job is to make sure that you do it according to our rules. See? So that made life very difficult for EDB. And of course, EDB itself, being a promotion agency, tended to downplay the need for regulations.
Still, these problems paled in comparison to what was to happen during those 2 years when Singapore was part of Malaysia. Because of differences in creating what the vision of Malaysia should be, Singapore was thrown into a grave period of racial tensions. Curfews had to be imposed. Then on the 9th of August 1965, Singapore's destiny was rewritten by these very words of the late Tunku Abdul Rahman.
Sometimes there have been differences between the central government and the leaders of the Singapore state government. And these differences take so many forms and are of so many kinds that it has not been possible to resolve them. And so we decided that we must part company.
I did not believe that there was no other way. I believed then that I could still convince the Tunku that there were a number of other ways of reducing communal tensions in Malaysia, such as a looser federation. But after my talk with the Tunku, I realized there was no other way than what he thought was the solution. That means we have to leave Malaysia. Every time we look back on this moment when we signed this agreement which severed Singapore from Malaysia, it will be a moment of anguish. For me, it is a moment of anguish because all my life I had believed in merger and the unity of these two territories.
Well, it was a completely desperate situation in a way, because we were the center of the British Empire in Southeast Asia, the commercial and the administrative center. So when we were asked to leave, Indonesia was confronting both Singapore and Malaysia. So there was no trade. Then we knew that the Malaysians had every intention of bypassing us and doing all their trade direct, and also not giving us their markets. So we were like a head without a body. And it was a very bleak situation. But we were determined that we would not just sit down and die.
The separation sparked off mixed reactions among the young EDB officers. What could Singapore do without any natural resources and a hinterland?
Milton Friedman asked Mr. Dhanabalan and say, what are you fellas going to do now that, you've been reduced to a very small size, no Malaysia, are you going to be able to survive?
So we said, we never thought of that. But he says, you must think of that, no? What if you don't succeed? So it never entered our minds. Our purpose is to get the job done. and we would do everything possible to get the investments in. So I think our frame of mind was such that we never thought of failure. We just had to get the job done.
In a lot of countries, if you're not successful in industrial development, people just go back to the farms. There is a buffer. So in the farms, at least you can get half a day's work, a quarter day's work. In a highly urban economy like Singapore, if you don't get a job, you don't get a job. And what does that mean, politically? It's like a time bomb.
The mid-1960s was a period of uncertainty for the pioneer EDB officers like Chan Chin Bok. They literally became door-to-door salesmen selling Singapore. Worse yet, they had to sell Singapore to a world where many had never heard of it.
Usually starts with a geography lesson. Where is Singapore? And then you go to the map, you go to the globe. Many of these people have got the revolving globe in their rooms. They say, oh, that's where it is. It's very close to Vietnam.
But Vietnam was then overrun by the communists, and the great domino theory was propagated. If Vietnam falls, what about Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore?
So we start with having to explain the political stability. Then we go on to other things. And all this must be done in about half an hour. You're given about half an hour. So if you're not convincing in a specific case that you can make out for Singapore within the half an hour, that meeting is going to be your first and your last, you see. So it's quite, it's quite tough.
Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, recently went on a visit to London, Moscow and Cambodia to meet people, leaders in other countries, and to help promote trade, without which Singapore would die.
What the early EDB officers did was to maximize their opportunities. Each time the political leaders went abroad, they tried to get potential investors to meet up with them. Any fuzzy notions about the region they had could then be cleared right away.
CEOs are leaders themselves, and they respect leadership in other people, whether of a company or more so of a country. So they want to be able to size up, and they want to see his grasp of political events, how much of an in-charge person, he is, and the reliability and the predictability.
Singapore's industrial program is such a success that its own momentum is carrying it on to Phase 2 without the pause planned after Phase 1. Finance Minister Dr. Goh Keng Swee sometimes launches 2 or even 3 factories in a day.
Back home, Dr. Goh was seen practically everywhere, opening new factories, but it was a case of wanting to be seen for a good reason. One of Dr. Goh's assistants remembers those days well.
I must tell you that when I first started DB, I was known then as the promotion officer. Means I was the, shall we say, in the Chinese dialect, I was the gong. I beat the gong for him, you see. So he used to ask me, he says, every week he used to call me up. He says, look, every week I must go and open 4 factories, and you have to write short speeches for me. So one day I asked Dr. Goh, I said, Dr. Goh, why do you want to waste your time opening peanut factories, hair cream factories, nail factories, at one stage even, I think, joss paper factory. So he says, he told me, he said, yeah, he said, don't you worry, he says, because my whole idea is to create, the impression that people are having great confidence in Singapore, and that I'm opening factories every other day in Singapore.
And still another new one, a paint factory. At home, a good month for industrial growth in Singapore. In fact, Finance Minister Dr. Goh Keng Swee was nearly run off his feet, either opening brand new factories or visiting others already in production to cheer them along.
Out they go into service. 5 new buses to serve the city, and all assembled in Singapore.
Just when the industrialization efforts were taking off, another serious blow was dealt to Singapore when the British decided to withdraw their troops in January 1968.
two problems immediately came to mind. First, who would defend us? Because then we would be completely vulnerable, which meant that we had to build up our own army, navy, and air force at great speed and at great expense. Because without that, without security, who would invest?
National service was introduced quickly in 1967, with Dr. Goh Keng Swee assuming his new portfolio as Minister for Defence. For the 30 to 40,000 odd workers who were under British employment,
You see the whole of that head of land.
Today, cracker plants, pipelines and oil stacks, all part of a giant metal maze, stand on what was once just swamp and mangrove. Today, Pulau Air Merbau is home to Singapore's petrochemical industry, an industry worth billions of dollars a year. Still, this complex had a difficult beginning. Even before it started operations in 1984, this project, or PCS as it is commonly known, had its share of critics. Poor economic conditions had led to a soft market in the petrochemical industry. So could this multi-million-dollar project go bust? Many thought so, and the backers of the project faced tremendous pressure. Nyam Tong Dao was one of its main backers.
As you know, PCS is a massive investment, petrochemicals, billions of dollars. So not every company can put out a PCS project, and the markets only increase incrementally, So there's no overnight market like electronics, the growth. We position ourselves, and once we position ourselves, and since the fundamentals are correct, the project must come about.
It did, eventually. The petrochemical industry picked up, and the investors were able to make good on their investments.
To me, PCS would hold two lessons. One, you got to make sure you get the fundamentals right. And I think we got the fundamentals right. And you have to have nerve to see you through periods of downturns.
We didn't fight our way through against all the skeptics, we wouldn't have it. So the lesson for EDB is, if you think you are right, go and get it. Show tenacity.
While PCS was successful, not every investment or decision had a happy ending. Every decision involved a certain risk, a risk that things might not work out as expected. He's experienced some of those. Philip Yeo is the current chairman of the EDB. He's helped to bring in $6.8 billion of investments to Singapore just last year alone. A very impressive record, but still not a perfect one. There was at least one investment that got away.
The lesson I can remember on 86 when I met a company, I remember in Japan, and the company said, look, When we wanted to come to Singapore in the late 70s, you were not keen on us because you consider us labor intensive. And that to me is a strategic error, because when you don't welcome him in the first place, you lose him forever. Investment is a zero-sum game. So he went off, and I think that was a mistake we made. We were very trying to be pick and choose. What we want our officers to know is don't look for just the cream of the cake. You have to see the substance and the depth. So what we have done over the last 2-3 years was look at the industry, not by itself, but by the cluster. This industry, it may not be the most highly capital intensive, but it has impact downstream. The next phase will be capital intensive, or the next phase. So therefore, you try to see as a whole cluster of businesses and activities, not just by itself. By itself, it may not be attractive. But if I bring this company in, I have a next downstream. On that was more capital intensive. So in a sense, I take a total view rather than a company by company view.
Failing in an investment or failing to bring home an investment involved a painful price. Singapore could lose job opportunities and millions of dollars in revenue from salaries, taxes, and other spin-offs. Still, such experiences offered valuable lessons to decision makers. In many ways, mistakes made were turned around so that there was always a lesson learned.
People thought we made mistakes, but actually I don't think they were mistakes. Certain industries were needed at that time because of the level of skills, because of the kind of investments that we were able to attract. We had to go into very low-level textiles, we had to go into sawn timber, go into plywood, all of which have now been more or less phased out of Singapore. But it was a process that we had to go through. It was needed at that time. They were good investments at that time. People who invested made money. Then subsequently, of course, became too expensive and they had to close it down. And I think that process will go on. Industries today will have to relook at some industries, for example, like ship repair. Should we in 10 years still have ship repair in Singapore, employing thousands of foreign workers, consuming a lot of land, or should we go to something else? I think what we learned was that we should not keep on promoting or trying to keep alive industries that were not viable anymore. Yeah, they were viable at one time. We promoted them, we gave them incentives, they were successful. But to keep on trying to go on trying to keep them alive, making efforts to keep them alive, that would be a mistake. And I think that mistake we have avoided.
Coming up next, coping with the 1985 recession, a time of tough decisions, sacrifice, and eventual success.
The economy would even slow down even more, and the second half of 1985 would actually see a shrinkage of the Singapore economy, which was a phenomenon which had not been seen in Singapore, I suppose, since perhaps the period of confrontation when we gained our independence, or during the period in the late 1960s when we had riots.
It was a time to examine the facts, the reasons, the changes, to see what policies were necessary in order to get the economy back on track.
Deputy Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong headed an economic committee to work out structural changes which should be implemented in the Singapore economy in order to take account of these new factors.
It's a very considerable responsibility to put on, not just on me, but on the 12 members of my committee. There was a sense of excitement. It was the first time we had done a committee like this with the private sector involved, and not just the 12 people, but they had subcommittees, and all in maybe a few hundred, perhaps 1,000 people were involved, different sectors, different industries, inputs brought in, filtered, saved, considered, finally made into a final report with major recommendations. I think that there was a sense of being involved, of participating in something significant and worthwhile. Proceeded on a different set of assumptions, that this was necessary for savings, that this was part of salaries, that we had to build this up, and we had built it up very painfully over the years to 50% of salaries. To now decide that we should cut it, especially after we had strenuously argued against people who said CPF is adding to costs. And we said, no, CPF is part of salary, it doesn't add to costs. Finally, we had to say, we said, Well, CPF is part of salary, but we have to reduce wages, and you can't, it's harder to reduce take-home pay. We have to do it by cutting the CPF. That was a big psychological leap. It took us a while, but I think we made the right choice.
That was not an economic issue, that was a political issue. And the question then became of how to convince the Singapore Electric to change a policy which the government, including I myself at the time, had defended for many months. Not easy. It is necessary for government to make a reversal of established policy if you want to get out of issue when you see that a certain course of action has to be taken. And I use that platform to explain to the public why we need to reconsider our CPF rate, and in fact to have a temporary reduction in our CPF rate if we wanted to get out of our economic recession. Senior minister, who was at that time Prime Minister, supported the decision. He proposed that we cut the employer's CPF contribution by 15%. Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong, who was of course at the time First Deputy Prime Minister, met with the trade unions, who was then led by President Ong Teng Cheong, to persuade them to exercise a policy of wage restraint.
After years of booming growth, workers were used to high increments in their salaries and yearly bonuses. To ask them to take a wage freeze, even if it was temporary, was a tall order. Still, they had to be convinced.
You as union leaders must explain this to your members and not to play just to rhetoric, say, why are we doing all this? We are selling out workers. We are not. We are helping them. We must be realistic and flexible. When a time is good, we get something. Time is not so good, we give back something. And if you want to insist, you want to talk tough and say, well, we must get this, we must get that. Why must we sacrifice? Can. But that is the message you give it away to international investors. You as union leaders has a responsibility to explain to your members what is good for them in the long run.
Workers saw the logic of this. Being less competitive means losing orders, and in turn, losing jobs. It was better to forego a bonus than to lose your job. Up next, the 90s. No more riots, no more strikes and unemployment. But are the days of worry really over?